Thanks, folks. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Before we get into the meat of our session today, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please join us next month on May 2nd, same time, 3 o'clock on Zoom, where I will be talking about how to talk about or not talk about climate change with very young children. How to think about programming for sort of the 0 to 8-year-old crowd. We also would love for you all to, if you have not already, join us on the NEMA portal, become a member of this community practice on the NEMA portal. And I'm going to put a link into the chat if I can open it. There we go. And that's it. And I'm going to introduce our guest this afternoon. So Leah Glasser is joining us to talk a little bit about energy and the history of energy and interpreting it. Leah is a professor of history and coordinator of the public history program at Central Connecticut State University. She earned her BA from Tufts University and her MA and PhD in history and public history from Arizona State University. She has worked in the field of public history and historic preservation for the last 30 years, consulting with municipal, state, and federal agencies, including positions at the United States Bureau of Reclamation and the National Park Service. For the last 20 years, while publishing books and articles around the history and interpretation of energy, she's also worked closely with the National Council on Public History to emphasize issues of environmental sustainability through conferences, committee work, and publications. Her current projects are co-editing a book about the cultural history of trees, which I'm fascinated. I want to hear more about that. And sorry, I interrupted your intro. And writing the historic resource student for Coltsville National Historic Park. Thanks so much for joining us, Leah, and I'll turn it over to you to get us going here.
Yeah, so I'm hopefully just waiting on an afterward, and then I'm sending off the manuscript for the tree thing. I want to do it before next week, so hopefully that's on the way. Yeah. So let me share here this presentation. I need to get this back here, so I'm okay, there we go. All right, can everybody see that?
Looks like it's not in presenter mode yet, but
yeah,
can see...
no, it's not.
Okay,
and then I'm it is swap displays. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me to talk about the Interpreting Energy book, which is part of the AASLH series. And I was fortunate enough to present this with two great presenters at NEMA last October. Because after, of course, as one is putting this together, as one is putting this together and as I'm almost done with it and certainly after I finish it, then all these people come out of the woodwork and you realize you're not the only one thinking about this. So this is by no means supposed to be, the end all be all of this topic. It is supposed to be the very beginning of it and to get people thinking about different ways of interpreting energy at historic sites. So here's the book, obviously. Most of you are really familiar, obviously, with the fact that museums have been thinking, and preservation and public history has been thinking about climate change for a while. Sarah Sutton has been kind of on the forefront of greening museums and thinking about how to make museums not only educate about, but in practice, be a model. The National Trust for Historic Preservation for years now has been advocating the fact that buildings that exist are the greenest kinds of buildings. And so I have several examples of that. we know that historians have to be really concerned about climate change too, because all of our resources are in jeopardy from things like sea rise and tornadoes and fires and things like that. So very much, we've been talking about museums and climate change for a while, but what I didn't see was a lot of discussion about energy. So why did I get interested in this? Here's just an example of, well, three of them are on the left here are examples of stuff that I had worked on. And then on the right are things that others have been thinking about in terms of the cross section between public history and climate change. So this has been these kinds of overlap between public history and environmental sustainability, or public history and issues of climate change, has been in my mind for a while. But why interpret energy specifically? Because I had a background in it between Bureau of Reclamation and the electricity stuff. But we know that energy and our use of fossil fuels is one of the primary causes for climate change, and we need all hands on deck. I mean, there's certainly there is a lot to do. Most of the burden is with big corporations and with governments, but we really do need all hands on deck, and it's very clear that scientists are failing to communicate. And so when I was watching, just talk to you guys about my daughter who's really interested in environmental issues. So we were watching the Greta Thunberg documentary, and she had a great line in there: "We cannot overestimate the power of storytelling," which really resonates, obviously, with us historians, in terms of really understanding, what we can do about this, or what part we can play in communicating climate change. And then historian David Nye, who's been around for a long time in terms of writing about energy, his line about our high energy lifestyle is a confluence of cultural choices, that also really got me thinking of the fact that we as historians can talk to people about different choices that we've made in the past. And we're all about cultural decisions and cultural behavior and context. And I feel like that's something that can really be communicated in the museum world. Talked about the confluence between energy and, the environment and public history, but in terms of energy and public history, first of all, the environmental movement and the energy crisis kind of coincided with the development of the public history profession. So in a lot of ways, it makes a lot of sense. I think when people first see these things together, they're not sure how they fit together. But public history as a field, is founded in California in 1979. And that's, right in there with the energy crisis. And in the rise of the popularity of environmental history. Other ideas fulfilling the need, it's the Brundtland Commission's definition: fulfilling the needs of current generations without compromising the needs of future generations. This is why we do historic preservation in the first place, right? We want to maintain these resources for the future. And so in that way, these are really consistent missions. And then where I think where energy and the environment really became relevant is that historic sites offer place-based context, technologies, and strategies. And often with energy, we tend to talk about energy irrespective of place. And that's part of the problem in terms of how we use energy. We separate energy production and use from the place that it is actually first generated. And there's a disconnect between where energy comes from and how we use it. And that's something that we can help illuminate with historic sites, because energy is place-based until it's not. And that kind of has become part of our problem, or that's the argument in this book. So some of the themes that I talk about in this book are to just communicate the idea that energy has a history, and because energy has a history, it's something that we can talk about at historic sites. There are certain sites that can emphasize generation and development, can really talk about the origins of different energy sources and how energy development and generation work. And then even more sites can talk about use, both in terms of domestic use and industrial use. And as part of that use, there's the idea of our dependence on electricity and its relationship with national security. And as I'll talk about in a minute, nuclear energy kind of falls into that category. Sorry, that was a repeat there. And then the idea of who has access to that energy and whether that energy is distributed equitably. And then to emphasize the fact that we have, as a human race, been transitioning into different electrical and different energy forms constantly, and that energy transition and diversification is not something that we should be talking about as something new, but something that is historically consistent with what we've been doing all along. So not every museum can use energy as material culture, but a lot can, some more directly than others. So the way this book is organized is I organize it by different energy sources, and I start with wood and really emphasize the furnaces. I did the administrative history for the Hopewell furnace in Pennsylvania, the Hope Furnace National Historic Site. So that was another project that was related to energy. But the Beckley Furnace in East Canaan, Connecticut has a cool little, like, you can see this is just at a picnic table. It's an outdoor park. And they use literally the minerals and the raw materials that make iron as part of that material culture. That is then all heated up in a furnace with charcoal, and all of these materials then create that heat and eventually form the iron out of these materials. So there's lots of ways that we can analyze different kinds of material culture, especially in terms of things like charcoal, or in terms of some of the products that are involved in generating energy. And we can apply that when we talk about different kinds of material culture in terms of energy. And these are just kind of the basics of talking about material and material culture. Genesis, that's where we get wood being made into charcoal, the construction of that, how charcoal is made, the function of it, interpreting how that charcoal is then used with these raw materials to eventually interpret that. Other sites have things like the Sloan Museum in Connecticut. This is a machine that was, I believe, there's horses they used horses, but they could also use dogs to make these kinds of machines. Just having museums who have these kinds of museums that can emphasize muscle energy as the most basic kind of energy. There's an example of a horse on one of these things, how they would create muscle energy to operate farm machinery. And as I said, this one from the Sloan Museum is about dog. They put a dog on it, apparently, so it's a little bit smaller. But there's a lot of different museums that have these different items of material culture and don't really talk about them in terms of energy. They talk about them mainly in terms of maybe technology or just agriculture, but they don't focus it as part of that story as energy. So even if you don't have one of these, if you have an agricultural museum or something, you can talk about these kinds of muscle energy machines through advertisements, like in the Sears Roebuck catalog here. So I first talk about wood. And as I said, the iron furnaces use iron ore, limestone, but also carbon fuel. And so they're a real example, just to focus not on necessarily the iron being made, but how the iron is made. How iron furnaces work. they take all of the iron ore and the limestone, and then they heat up the furnace here. This is at the Saugus Iron Works, and it's a little model. Those are both my kids looking at them when they were little. A long time ago. He's a junior in high school now. But then we have the remnants of these furnaces, but by using dioramas or video, we can really explain how that fuel is generated without actually making the charcoal in front of people, as that's going to emit more carbon into the air. However, as part of my recommendations, I do advocate that maybe once a year or on rare occasions, there are demonstrations in terms of things like charcoal making demonstrations to show people the process of how that energy was made. And Hopewell Furnace does that like once a year. Beckley also has, you can go to these sites and you can see the water power, which turned the wheel, which then the wheel was used to blow air, which made the furnace hotter. And here's a turbine here as well. And you have these different forms of energy just present at the same sites so that you can talk about that. There's some interpretation. But even if you don't have a site like an iron furnace to talk about energy, if a lot of sites and historic homes might have something like these iron stoves, and this is a product that came out of these iron furnaces. And then like the iron furnaces, these kinds of ranges also used wood as heat energy. So then you can talk about using heat energy and wood as energy within the stove. And at the same time, the entire stove is made as a result of energy from wood, which became charcoal, which heated up the furnace. So there's an example of a charcoal demonstration, charcoal making demonstration. Sorry, I didn't mean to. The one chapter then is about water and water power. And you saw water power had a role in the iron furnace as well. Lowell Mills is an example that really talks about the technology, but not only does it talk about the technology, it actually shows an operating turbine, which is operated by water power. And so having those kinds of displays and emphasizing how that energy is produced, how water then fuels the turbine, which then creates movement or even electricity, is something that needs to be emphasized at sites just as much as some of the labor history that often is. This particular Francis turbine is at Lowell National Historic Park, but it's not in the main part, and you have to kind of take a separate tour to see it. And I guess, you know, when we think about interpreting energy, we need to maybe center some of these stories a little more, that it's literally kind of been sidelined in favor of the story of labor, which is also important, but if we want to emphasize energy, we need to center those stories a little bit more. One of the examples that I really liked was by the agency that I used to work for in Arizona, but they didn't have this exhibit when I was there. This is literally an operational hydroelectric turbine, but it's also an exhibit. And it's on a park line. So people encounter it when they're walking or riding their bike, and they can go in and literally interact with the turbine and how it's working and the falling water at this place. And it has interpretive signs all around. All along some of the recreational paths, they also explain not only how the canals work, but how the hydroelectric power works to deliver hydroelectric power to the Salt River Valley in Arizona. The issue of steam was what really inspired me for a lot of this project. I was really familiar with the Durango trains, particularly the one in Durango from the time when I was a small child. And then I live obviously in Connecticut, where they had the Sabino steamship. And they don't have this exhibit with the coal sitting there anymore, because now this was about in 2013, and since then they've migrated this exhibit so that it is no longer going to operate in the same way, in its historic way, with steam anymore, at least not on a regular basis, and I'll explain that in a minute. But you can see that both the steam engine and the steamship would belch out this coal fire smoke, which is a little problematic, particularly for a place like Mystic, when it is a place like Mystic that it is advocating itself as a green museum, and it has a very popular exhibit that's spewing out coal smoke. And then on the case of Durango, there was a real fight. There was a lot of complaining about the smoke for years and years. There was incredible resistance. Both places were arguing historic integrity for that technology. But we're in an era of climate change where not only is this kind of image not celebrated, but in the case of Durango, eventually the sparks fell out of the train and ignited one of the worst forest fires in Colorado's history. And so eventually both of these historic properties have migrated away from their traditional coal fire and replaced, or not replaced, but supplemented the steam engines with electrical engines, or in the case for right now, I think a diesel engine. That's me enjoying the train ride just to make sure that I'm not against the trains. But here you have the steam engine at Mystic, and what they've done is not remove the steam engine. It is still operational when they want to use it, but they retrofitted the Sabino to have a adjacent diesel engine, hopefully someday electrical engine when they get permission from the Navy, and battery-powered engine to go alongside of it. You can see that they're kind of retrofitting a place to put the additional engine alongside. So it's a way to interpret the original steam engine, but at the same time be able to educate riders about the two different kinds of energy sources that can operate this boat, and to show that transition. So they're not getting rid of it, they're preserving in place. And that's a really big idea, I think, when it comes to energy technology, is to try to preserve in place so you don't get rid of it, but you don't have to always operate it in the same way in order to show people that this is the way it did operate, but now we're going to operate the machine in this way. So Mystic Seaport can, have a really interesting energy narrative in this way, where you have the whale boat and talk about the use of whale oil, and whale oil for lighting, which is this is in one of their exhibits. And then you see people's, transition from using whale oil for lighting and for energy and for to coal fire and to steam. And then we talk about the transition from steam to electric, battery powered, diesel, or what have you, something cleaner. And then they have now their new very green visitor center. So they have a little bit of a narrative in terms of the story of energy going on here. Fossil fuels are obviously the big issue when it comes to climate change, and those are the most popular museums when we talk about energy museums. And one of the biggest ones is the Petroleum Museum in Midland, Texas. I actually have a friend who works at the community college down in Midland, and he really wants to bring me down to talk to the fossil fuel companies there about interpreting energy. But you can see there's a real celebration of fossil fuels in these spaces. And I guess and what they do is they talk about their fossil fuels and it as a cultural thing, and recognizing that fossil fuels are a part of our culture is a way to make us more conscientious about why we use fossil fuels. And so while not every museum is going to be a fossil fuel museum, a lot of places have access to a lot of Petroliana or fossil fuel material culture that you can talk about the cultural aspects of fossil fuels. And I talk about that history in the book. And this was one of my most interesting favorites, is to have the oil rigs out there like a sculpture garden in the museum. How you display these things is really interesting. There's a lot of resistance in terms of what wind energy looks like. But what they've done is really emphasize the beauty of oil rigs, and in the museum too are a whole bunch of landscapes showing fossil fuel production on the Texas landscape. And then there's a lot that car museums can also do to emphasize the idea that fossil fuels were not a foregone conclusion for automobiles. That very early on, we had the option of doing electric cars. This is what a very early self-charging car, which is essentially what today's hybrids are. And that for various reasons, some that made sense at the time, some that were maybe economically driven. The combustion engine became the most economical and in some ways the most environmental at the time way to power most cars. One of my co-presenters in NEMA talked about, the great manure disaster of the 1890s, and cars were seen as a way of environmentally cleaning up the cities, because if it weren't for cars, then the cities were being overrun with horses. So that was a real temptation to go for the horseless carriage. And at the same time, petroleum was a byproduct of processing kerosene, and it was something that people just threw away. So it was seen as recycling a waste product that then became the major driver of cars. So rather than just talk about the different technology of cars, it's really important that particularly in places like auto museums to really talk about the source of the energy driving those cars. There's a chapter on nuclear energy. I won't spend too much time on this, but that talks not only about the origins of nuclear power in terms of national security, but then the efforts to make energy, maintain energy security for the United States by transitioning nuclear power from its military purpose to a domestic purpose. And places like the B reactor in Hanford have tried to do this. And 3 Mile Island in Harrisburg, of course, is the perfect example of that. But right now, it only has very limited interpretation. And it's something that could really tell a much larger story about how we tried to transition from nuclear military power to more energy, to an energy alternative, using nuclear power to help secure our national security, or national security energy, national energy security in that way. There's limited sites that can talk about that, but most nuclear power plants can really help move that story forward. The ubiquitousness of nuclear energy and uranium as a source and as a material culture product that was used for this incredibly powerful energy is often in a lot of different house museums in the form of Vaseline glass or something like this. So there's places that even small house museums can find small examples in their material culture to talk about the sources, the mineral sources of energy, and can talk about these bigger stories. Renewables, obviously windmills go way back in terms of windmills being an energy source to operate farming equipment, to harness energy. Mid-century modern homes were early examples of solar energy. And then here's an example of solar panels being used on a historic building in Hamden to help tell a story of energy transition. Because one of the most popular and most interesting ways to maybe talk about energy is to really use housing, historic houses and historic house design for that passive energy. Talking about heating and cooling, passive forms of heating and cooling in architectural design, even the furnishings in historic houses, to talk about refrigeration without electricity, without fossil fuels. So these are different examples of different kinds of housing styles. The salt box was often rear facing. It broke up the wind pressure on a house, and so that their salt boxes were the most traditional kind of colonial house, and those, because of their design, were incredibly energy efficient. They were often, again, rear facing. They're rear facing to the north winds, so it often shielded them from the winds, and often with the centralized heating, they were, it helped a lot in terms of keeping people warm. This one on the left is a Victorian home. The idea of porches was not just to be cute and neighborly, but often it was an issue of keeping cool. You had sleeping porches. In the South, you have these dog trot houses that allow for additional circulation, and even just the fenestration, the positioning and locating of different windows to enhance circulation in the house is an example of passive cooling, and to talk about kind of more sustainable types of HVAC. So here's an example in the Chief Vann Historic Site oops, what happened here? NCPH last year, that after I had actually already sent in the manuscript for this book, they were talking about some really fun examples that this house, which has nothing to do with the significance of this historic site, this was a Native American plantation. Just want to make sure I leave time for questions. Native American plantation, but she talked a lot about the design of the house, that this center hall, not a center hall fireplace, but in this case, a center staircase, which would suck all the air up the stairs and allow for greater circulation. There's the fireplaces in every one of the rooms, but you also had refrigeration down in the root cellar. And so to emphasize those passive heating and cooling system in the houses is a way to raise the issue of energy. You can do that in all sorts of different houses. Even the houses of the 1920s, you can see here that this was once an open porch. That was porches would and overhangs would help cool the air just outside of windows so that you could open the windows and allow for air circulation. But at a certain point after World War II, these porches were often closed in, and we don't have that passive circulation anymore. So we need machines and HVAC systems to cool us off now in these places. And so you have much less efficient heating and cooling systems than we used to have. So different examples again of using wood energy or for cooking, different kinds of coal energy for cooking in this potbelly stove. The Franklin stove also used different kinds of whether it's wood pellets or coal for heating and cooking. Here again is kind of how the center hall chimney works, that it was doubled as both heat for cooking, but also heat for warmth. And then that stove that I kind of to come back around and talk about some of these iron ranges that used either stove or coal for heating of both food, but also the household. There's a more detailed example of refrigeration. And finally, there's the idea of talking about infrastructure and the grid and the delivery of some of how that energy is first manufactured at powerhouses and then how it's delivered along electrical lines. Obviously, if you have a place that can talk about that you can see electrical lines, you can talk about some of that delivery, but many historic homes have these insulators that were part of that electrical system, and that helps you talk about how electricity is delivered, how electricity is generated, and how it travels across and is transmitted through these copper lines, and how these insulators harness that energy and keep it from obviously catching fire or what have you. And that's part of that infrastructure that delivers that power to all sorts of different communities. And so just even having these insulators helps you talk more broadly about the grid. You can talk about solar energy. This is an example where you have the cultural meaning of electricity and lightning as part of the Navajo tradition. And then you see that the Navajos are now kind of harnessing the sun to use electricity and power their reservation off the grid. So there's stories there. The Collinsville Axe Powerhouse is no longer operational, but what they've done is preserve in place, as I said, so that one can still go and see the original generation technology in those places. And so this is just another example of imagining energy narratives, and this is kind of rounded up. This is the Eli Whitney Museum in the town of Hamden, where I live, which is right next to New Haven. You see it's originally founded because of the water power. And the water power, it was the first place to really harness water power for machinery. And they, not only can you see the waterfall back here and the reservoir up here, but they have these kind of interactive water displays outside. They have examples of the machinery on the inside. Although this is mainly not a museum, it's actually more of a place where kids interact and do projects. It's kind of more of an after-school program and a camp right now. But by interpreting not only the water power, but this site after it was after it was used to manufacture firearms. It was used to actually manufacture gas ranges, so you can tell that story at this single site. You can, it has stories about the operation of the turbine. There is a powerhouse on site that again is a way to explain the transition from wood to gas to electricity. Talks about the transition not only of the energy, but also the site, because eventually the site also manufactured wire, copper wire that was then used for electrical purposes. So there's lots of different kind of layers of the story of energy. And then this house that I showed you before was the boarding house for the workers. And it's just across the street, and they use solar power now. So you can kind of talk about these different forms of energy all at the same site. So what the book does is, I didn't get really into the history of each of these types of energy sources, but it gives an overview of each of those different types of energy sources, and then gives examples of different sites that tell those energy stories and how they tell them. So it provides some of the science and technology history, but in a way that, you know, most interpreters at historic sites can hopefully digest it. It's organized, as I said, by energy type and source. It offers just different ways of thinking about energy and cultural values and cultural places, and offers some case studies. So that's kind of what I have for right now, and hopefully that's enough to sort of answer any questions that you might have. Let me get out of here and end the show. Let me go. See, how do I stop? How do I stop here? There we go. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Leah, I don't have a question. That was a very good presentation. But an example of the transition in energy sources. I just did some research recently on the Mount Washington Cog Railway.
Mm-hmm.
And that was built actually immediately after the Civil War. World's first mountain climbing cog railway before anything in Switzerland. And it was built with coal-fired steam engines, built on a crazy angle so that when they were on the steep slopes, the boiler would be approximately level. And my visit there was, first time was, 40 to 50 years ago, when there was all these diesel or all these coal-fired engines.
Yeah.
And then 5 years ago, my wife and I made another trip there, and they're basically now all biodiesel, 20% bio, and they still run. They refurbished 2 of the original coal-fired locomotives, and usually first run in the morning. Always sells out. They'll run one steam engine up so people can see how that operated. And I guess my hope now is that the next iteration will be electric.
Yeah, I mean, that's
soon.
a great example, I think, of where, hopefully a lot of these sites are going, and the way that kind of Mystic Seaport went, and that even the Durango Railroad is going, is respecting that, previous technology, but using keeping the resource, transitioning the energy, but making that story, right, part of the interpretation, explaining why you're no longer running the steam engine or running it this way. Being transparent about that now we can do it this way, right? And obviously, as you said, the hope also for Mystic, they originally wanted to do a battery-powered engine, and they hoped to do that at some point, but the Navy wouldn't allow them because, or it was the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard wouldn't allow them. They are too afraid it's going to blow up or something. So they want to make sure the technology for the battery is more secure. Originally, they said yes, and then they kind of backed out on it. So they replaced it with, I think a diesel powered engine, but it's much better at least than the coal fire. But that's a great example of being able to still interpret this older technology, but front loading the energy story.
Yeah, and in Norway, when talking about ships, boats, they now are building a lot of commercial ferries that are totally electrified, and that's becoming a big thing there.
Yeah, there's one example that I talk about in the book where, again, these ships, for example, are considered like the last steam engine or the last steam ferry. And so people don't want to change them, right? Because that's like, ruining the history. But if you're able to interpret that history and you're able to preserve the technology in place, that way people can see the older technology, understand how it works. And as you said, even once in a while, make it operational. But it doesn't have to be the only way that these kinds of vehicles or equipment is operated on a daily basis. There was a lot of pushback for the steamship because people love to ride it, but people didn't like to ride it because of the coal fire engine. They like to ride it because they like to ride around on a boat, in the water. And certainly the education of the steam engine was part of the program, but they can still talk about that.
I'm curious if you have examples or if you have any thoughts about how to you sort of alluded to the idea that we might want to talk about energy transition, because of climate change, right? And I'm curious about any examples of interpretive practices, or again, if you just have any thoughts about are there folks who are really centering that? Are there folks who are really doing a good job of bringing that advocacy, bringing that call to action aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are just kind of beginning to think about this and do that. And it's always tricky, in this kind of highly politicized world, to do that kind of call to action advocacy. But I think what we can do, and you have to obviously read your audience, but what you can do is emphasize that historically, we have used these different types of energy at this site, or we've used these different types of energy sources for cooking or heating, or look at this house, like it used to operate like this, but now we have these HVAC systems in there. And and just to make that transition, that change over time, which we talk about, in terms of other historical stories, but really talk about it in terms of energy, and maybe not so subtly, but with the message being, we can still transition again. We can put solar panels on historic houses. We can restore older houses so that they are more as efficient in terms of their passive heating and cooling, or we can design buildings today that take some of these lessons from older architecture before there were HVAC systems, right? That can then take less pressure off of our current HVAC systems. And you can certainly make, you know, all of those points, so that people can leave these places knowing what's possible, because I think what the assumption is that this is just the best way, and how do we retrofit these places, and that it's too hard to transition or diversify. And so are we ever going to convince everybody that we, you know, eventually fossil fuels are just going to run out? But when, you know, I believe if I ever do end up talking to any fossil fuel companies about this, we're going to talk about the idea of diversification, right? Putting less pressure on different sources of energy so that you can use less of each source. But as we see historically, we used lots of different types of energy sources for lots of different things. And we need to, and historically we can show that. And so it's not like this is a new thing. Renewable energy and energy diversification is not new. It's old.
Leah, it's really, thank you so much for your presentation. It's so interesting hearing you talk about kind of that shift from technology changes over time as it relates to kind of almost nostalgia, or like, this is the way we've always done things here at X institution.
And this is American history, you know, like those cultural images of the train and the steam engine and the oil rigs and that aesthetic, you know, that's cultural.
Yeah.
And so, you know, then you can show like the windmills, you know, that's the huge resistance against the windmills. But how is that any different than the oil rigs on the landscape, or the beauty of the steam engine, steam train? And I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
No. It's really, I can see lots of overlap with a whole bunch of our, you know, different affinity groups here at NEMA, and also thinking of just like technology shifts over time, as you're saying, like salt box houses with solar energy, and like when we can get funding to do those things, you know, it can be really successful, not only for the institution, but also for the community. So really
yeah, I was
wonderful.
reading one with the salt box houses because it's such a huge roof. You know, obviously it's also pitched, so you don't need to worry about, you know, the snow and the water damage, but also there's a huge roof to put solar panels on. And so you can have a lot more surface area for that. They can become even more efficient, you know. Take that older model and apply, you know, different, you know, window fenestration, and take the placement, follow that historic thought with where the windows are all located, because in newer houses, it's kind of random. It's where people kind of want a window. Whereas in some of those older houses, like the bungalow, you would open up the door and the stairway's right there. And then there's a window at the top of the stairway that nobody's going to really look at, because that's not what it's for. It's not for looking out. It's for sucking the air upstairs. And then using those cross breezes to keep cool. We don't think about that anymore. So we can learn things in terms of future design, again, so that you use your air conditioning less because you have more ventilation.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or even data or findings around, does the general public, you know, what is their general knowledge of, or what is their energy literacy, you know, in an ecological context? Like, do they get you know, why burning coal is bad, you know, and do they get, you know, what fossil fuels really mean? And, you know, so you know, how far back do you have to go in the kind of energy literacy storyline for people
Yeah, I mean, I
to
think
put all
you
this
have to
together?
start pretty basic, right? And that's where those, you know, even just taking a piece of coal and you know, letting people touch the piece of coal and understand that this is and the difference between a piece of coal and charcoal. You know, charcoal comes from wood. You know, people don't understand the difference between those. And really getting them to think about this is what's creating the energy. The same amount of energy can be created in these different forms, like just to even understand the turning of a wheel, whether it's a turbine, whether it's being powered by water or it's being powered by steam.
Or a dog.
Or a dog, right? It's the same mechanism. And so the source of the energy we use isn't so important, right? To do what we want it to do. And I think if people kind of understand that we have options for what initially propels that machinery and those wheels, you know, I think if you just can start really basic, that's why I do really like the dog trot thing, because it's like, it's very basic, and yes, things are more sophisticated now, but it's still the same basic idea about what different gauges and
Still turn the wheel. Yeah.
belts. Yeah, turning the machine and making it and all of that, making it go. And you know, how that pushes, again, the same mechanisms push the air through your house. You know, so yeah, we can put the air conditioner or the heater in the basement and push all that air through your house, or you can make your windows do that kind of work.
So great. Thanks so much, Leah, for joining us today. Thanks everybody else for attending. I am going to put thank you, Scarlett, for putting that link to the May meeting. And I'm also going to put a very short feedback survey, which we're going to try to make a practice as we go, so we can kind of get a sense of how everybody's appreciating these sessions. So thanks so much for your time, everyone, and have a great and hopefully safe and dry rest of your afternoon
Yeah,
today.
thank you for the invitation, everyone. Safe travels.
Thanks, everybody.